5. 27 years. That's how long Richard III lay beneath a parking lot, his grave forgotten, his bones undisturbed. When scientists finally extracted his DNA in 2012, they solved a centuries-old mystery about where the lost king was buried. But they also uncovered a scandal. The royal Y chromosome didn't match the family tree. Someone in the Plantagenet dynasty wasn't who they claimed to be. The last king of England to die in battle fell here, Richard III, 32 years old. Multiple wounds to the skull. A blade sliced off the back of his head, exposing brain tissue. Another thrust penetrated clean through. After his body was stripped and mutilated, humiliation injuries inflicted as posthumous revenge, he was slung naked over a horse and paraded through Leicester's streets. 3 days later, he was buried without ceremony in the choir of Greyfriars Friary. No coffin, just a hastily dug grave. Within 50 years, the friary was demolished. The grave marker vanished. For centuries, historians believed his bones had been thrown into the River Soar. Langley, a screenwriter with no archaeological training, reads a biography of Richard III. Something doesn't align with the monster Shakespeare portrayed. She begins researching. 6 years later, standing in a Leicester parking lot where medieval maps suggest Greyfriars once stood, she experiences what she calls an intuitive certainty. She's standing on Richard's grave. The lot belongs to the City Council's Social Services Department. Busy, essential. Getting permission to dig here would require something extraordinary. Langley can't simply ask to excavate for a king's bones. Archaeologists don't hunt for celebrities. But there's another angle. The lost Greyfriars Church. That's archaeology. That's legitimate. She begins building her case. Historian John Ashdown Hill has already done the impossible. He's traced an unbroken female bloodline from Richard's sister, Anne of York, to a living Canadian cabinet maker named Michael Ibsen. If remains are found, mitochondrial DNA can confirm identity. The pieces are assembling. Langley approaches the university. Initial ground-penetrating radar finds nothing. Sponsors withdraw. 10,000 pounds short. She turns to the Richard III Society worldwide. Within 2 weeks, members donate 13,000 pounds. The dig is on. 5. 27 years to the day after Richard's burial, archaeologist Richard Buckley admits this is a desperate long shot. 17% of the original Greyfriars site remains unbuilt. The team can only excavate 1% of that, constrained by funding, time, and the parking lot's operational needs. Buckley estimates 50-50 odds of finding the church, 9-1 against finding the grave. He jokes that he'll eat his hat if they find Richard. Trench 1 cuts directly over the faded R painted on the asphalt, the reserve space Langley fixated on years earlier. 4.5 hours into the dig, osteoarchaeologist Joe Appleby uncovers leg bones. Then arms. Then ribs. The spine emerges twisted into an S-curve. Scoliosis. Severe lateral curvature. Appleby carefully exposes the skull. Deep gouges. Blade wounds. This man died violently. Dr. Turi King extracts DNA from a tooth. Ancient DNA work requires sterile conditions. Any contamination renders the sample useless. The tooth is cleaned with UV light, crushed, and processed. Mitochondrial DNA is targeted first because there are multiple mitochondria per cell, increasing recovery odds. Nuclear DNA contains just 1 copy per cell, often degraded after 5 centuries. Michael Ibsen, the Canadian cabinet maker, descended from Richard's sister through an all-female line, provides a comparison sample. So does a second distant relative, Wendy Duldig, traced through a separate all-female lineage. If the skeleton is Richard, both should match. The mitochondrial sequences load on King's screen. Match. Perfect alignment with Ibsen. Single base substitution with Duldig, a minor mutation over 22 generations, entirely expected. King does what she calls a little dance around the lab. The statistical probability, 99.9994%. This is Richard III. But there's a second test, a test that will uncover something far more explosive than confirming a king's identity. Y chromosomes pass from father to son, unchanged except for rare mutations. Richard III was the great-great-grandson of Edward III through Edward's son, Edmund, Duke of York. Tracing forward from Edward, genealogists identify 5 living men descended through an unbroken male line from Edward's other son, John of Gaunt. All 5 descend from Henry Somerset, 5th Duke of Beaufort, who died in 1803. If the Y chromosome inheritance held intact, these 5 men and Richard's skeleton should carry identical or near-identical Y chromosome markers. They're branches of the same paternal tree planted by Edward III in the 1300s. The 5 living descendants match each other. Haplotype: R1BU152. The fifth carries a completely different marker evidence of a recent false paternity event in his own family tree. That's not shocking. Historical false paternity rates run 1 to 2% per generation, but Richard's Y chromosome doesn't match any of them. His marker, G2A, a haplogroup common in the Mediterranean 5 to 10%, but rare in Northern Europe. Roughly 1% of the British population carries it. This isn't a near match with minor drift. This is a completely different genetic lineage. Generations, separating Richard III from the 5th Duke of Beaufort. At least one woman in the royal bloodline conceived a child with a man who was not her husband. The child was raised as legitimate. The crown passed through him. And no one knew. There are 24 potential points where this break could have occurred. 4 generations separate Richard from Edward III. 15 more separate Edward from the Duke of Beaufort. Each represents a transmission from father to son, or what was believed to be father to son. Significant possibilities cluster around Edward III's sons. Edward had 5 sons who survived to adulthood. John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster, and Edmund of Langley, Duke of York, are the 2 that matter for this story. John of Gaunt's line produced the House of Lancaster kings Henry IV, V, and VI. Through his legitimized illegitimate children, the Beauforts, John's bloodline gave rise to Henry VII and the entire Tudor dynasty. Every monarch from Henry VII through Elizabeth I claimed the throne based on descent from John of Gaunt. Edmund of Langley's line produced the House of York, the rivals in the Wars of the Roses. His great-great-grandson was Richard III. Occurred between Edward III and John of Gaunt. If John was not Edward's biological son, then the House of Lancaster had no legitimate claim to the throne. Henry IV, who overthrew Richard II in 1399, was a usurper in genetic fact, not just political accusation. Henry V, the warrior king who won Agincourt, had no blood right to wear the crown. The Tudors Henry VII, Henry VIII, Elizabeth I built their dynasty on a biological lie. If the break occurred between Edward III and Edmund of Langley, then Richard III himself was the illegitimate king. The House of York's entire claim during the Wars of the Roses rested on fraudulent lineage. If it happened further down the line between Edmund and Richard, then perhaps Edward IV, Richard's older brother who ruled for 22 years, was illegitimate. Or Richard's father, also named Richard, Duke of York. The permutations multiply. Geneticists David Balding and Mark Thomas run the numbers. Over 19 generations, with a 1 to 2% false paternity rate per generation, the probability of at least one non-paternity event approaches certainty. The math is unforgiving. This finding shouldn't surprise anyone. But knowing the statistics and confronting physical proof are different experiences. The break is real, documented, locked in Richard's bones. Chromosome evidence proves the break exists. It cannot identify when it occurred. To pinpoint the generation, you'd need to exhume other Plantagenet kings, test Henry III, Edward I, Edward II, Edward III, test Richard II, test Henry IV, V, VI, test Edward IV, compare their Y chromosomes against each other and against Richard III. Some of those burials are known, others are lost. Exhuming anointed kings to settle a 500-year-old genealogical question isn't something undertaken lightly. The question remains unresolved. What makes this discovery so strange? There was no cover-up because no one knew. For 5 centuries, the secret remained buried literally in Richard's grave. The woman who conceived outside her marriage took the truth to her own grave. The child, raised as legitimate, never knew. The crown passed. Wars were fought. Dynasties rose and fell. Thousands died in the Wars of the Roses, arguing over who had the rightful bloodline. And the entire time, the genetic chain was already broken. Legally, no. Legitimacy in medieval England was determined by recognition, not biology. If a king acknowledged a child as his, that child was legitimate for purposes of succession. If a woman's husband accepted her child, paternity was established. Modern genetic testing doesn't retroactively invalidate historical reigns, but historically, the discovery rewrites our understanding of royal power. The Wars of the Roses, 30 years of civil war that killed tens of thousands, were fought over competing claims to Edward III's bloodline. Lancaster versus York, Red Rose versus White. Both sides wielded genealogy as their primary weapon. Both believed blood right conferred legitimacy. The DNA evidence proves that at least one side was wrong, possibly both. The same analysis that exposed the Y chromosome scandal also revealed Richard's appearance. 95% probability of blue eyes. 77% probability he had brown hair as a child, though it may have darkened with age. This matches a portrait from the early 1500s, commissioned after his death. The portrait shows no withered arm, a detail Shakespeare invented. The skeleton confirms it. No arm deformities. The scoliosis was real but manageable. Richard rode horses, fought in battles, ruled a kingdom. The curvature made one shoulder higher than the other, exactly as contemporary accounts described. 11 injuries on the skeleton, 9 to the head, 2 to the body. The 2 body wounds occurred after death, probably inflicted during the mutilation. The head wounds tell the story of his final moments. One blow from a bladed weapon, likely a halberd, cut away the back of his skull. If that didn't kill him instantly, a sword thrust through the base of the skull into the brain certainly did. Other wounds: a slice to the cheek, likely from a dagger. A puncture to the top of the skull. These men were trying to kill a king. They succeeded. The body was displayed publicly in Leicester for 2 days, then buried in the choir of Greyfriars. 10 years later, Henry VII, who had defeated Richard at Bosworth and claimed the throne, paid for a modest alabaster tombstone. It wasn't elaborate. Richard was a defeated enemy, but it marked the grave. In 1538, Henry VIII dissolved the monasteries. Greyfriars was demolished. The tombstone disappeared. Over the following centuries, the site became a mansion with gardens, then a street was built across it, then commercial buildings. By the 1900s, it was a parking lot. The grave was forgotten. In the early 2000s, a parking attendant named Mike Mistray painted a white R on the tarmac to mark a reserved space. He had no idea what lay beneath. When Philippa Langley saw that R in 2004, she interpreted it as a sign. When excavators cut Trench 1 in 2012, they aligned it using a white line painted across the lot. If that line had been 1 meter to either side, they would have missed the grave entirely. After 2 years of analysis, legal disputes about burial, location, and preparation, Richard III was reinterred at Leicester Cathedral. 20,000 people filed past his coffin during the 3-day lying-in state. The ceremony included a poem by Britain's poet laureate, read by Benedict Cumberbatch. Michael Ibsen, the Canadian cabinet maker, whose DNA proved Richard's identity, crafted the oak coffin himself. Richard was finally given the honor denied him in 1485. But the DNA scandal, the revelation that broke the royal bloodline, couldn't be buried again. A queen, or a duchess, or a countess, somewhere in the Plantagenet lineage conceived a child outside her marriage. We know that child became part of the royal succession. We know the genetic line fractures between Edward III and the 18th century. What we don't know, who she was, who the biological father was, or which generation concealed the secret. The answer remains locked in graves we haven't opened. Perhaps we never will. Third lies beneath a raised stone tomb in Leicester Cathedral. Visitors come from around the world. The King Richard III Visitor Center stands on the site of the parking lot where he was found. You can look through a glass floor and see the exact location of his grave, the spot beneath the letter R where everything changed. Every visitor asks the same question. If genetic testing can prove a break in the royal line, what else might we discover if we tested other monarchs? What other secrets are buried in royal tombs across England? The technology exists. The genealogical records exist. The bones exist. But some questions, once answered, can't be unasked. Some truths, once known, reshape everything that came before. Richard III's DNA didn't just identify a king. It exposed a scandal that had hidden for 500 years, proving that the bloodlines everyone died fighting over were never what they seemed. The crown was always about power, not biology. Richard's bones simply made that truth impossible to ignore.